Is this on? Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. I'm Katrina London. I'm the curator at the Pocantico Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to tonight's Spring Forum lecture, Rediscovering Ogden Codman Jr., Queer Life in the Gilded Age, with Dr. David D. Doyle, Jr. First, I'll just say our land acknowledgement. The Pocantico Center rests in Lenape-Hoking, unceded land of the native Lenape people. We honor the Lenape, past, present, and future, in gratitude and appreciation for their stewardship of this land for generations. Thank you all for joining us this evening for this very special event. It's such an honor to have Dr. Doyle here, and we're grateful that he traveled all the way from Texas to speak to us about Ogden Codman Jr., who was the influential American architect and interior decorator who designed Kykuit's interiors. He's most well known for co-authoring The Decoration of Houses for Edith Wharton in 1897. And he was hired by John D. Rockefeller Jr. in 1906 to lay out the interior architectural details of the house, including the famous oculus, and to furnish all the rooms. This included a budget for lengthy trips to France, as Codman described, to get the very best I could find of everything. And he did. Rather than focusing on his work at Kykuit, which I encourage you to all see on a tour of the house, tonight we are here to learn more about the man himself. It was little known before Dr. Doyle's pioneering scholarship that Codman was active in the gay subculture of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. His unapologetic self-understanding and connection with a community of queer men were distinguishing features of his life and work. Now it's my pleasure to officially introduce Dr. David Doyle. He's the Dean of Honors and Scholars Programs, Director of the University Honors Program, and an Adjunct Assistant Professor of History at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. He completed a PhD in American history from City University of New York, and he's working on a book examining male sexuality in late 19th century New York and New England. He's published pieces in Reviews in American History and the Journal of the History of Sexuality. So following Dr. Doyle's presentation, he'll take some questions from you all, and then we invite you to join us for refreshments in the gathering space next door. The gallery will also be open, which is currently showing the exhibition Portraits of Process. Thank you, and please help me to welcome Dr. Doyle to the stage.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very excited to be here to talk to you a little bit about Ogden Codman, but first I must be clear. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. I also must be on time, so I brought my watch. And I have a clicker. Wrong way. Okay, as many of you probably know, and as we just heard, Ogden Codman is most well known today for his collaboration with Edith Wharton and the book that they published in the 1890s. What I'd like to do tonight is to walk you through Codman's long life and career. Think of it as the whirlwind tour, the latest and the best hits of Ogden Codman, the architect, the decorator, the connoisseur. After reviewing his life briefly, then I want to peel back the layers, like an onion, peel back the layers of Ogden Codman to help you learn about other aspects of his life. He was very proud of his patrician New England lineage. He was very proud of his good taste. You will hear more about that. And he was also proud of his sort of exuberant approach to life in terms of his sexuality, I would say. Although what I hope you will discover by the time I finish, his identity is not necessarily one that we would recognize in our own world. In the 20th century, different types of identities have emerged, I would say, up until today, but I think my students are beginning to show me that identities might again be changing. So, what about Ogden Codman? He was born on Beacon Street in 1863. He grew up in Boston and different locations in France, and the family homestead, The Grange, in Lincoln, Massachusetts, which you're going to learn more about too, and which is also a museum you can go and visit. Codman lived a very long life. He survived the country's Gilded Age, as well as 2 world wars, and he died in France in 1951. Throughout his life, however, his house, The Grange, remained a touchstone, symbolizing his family's position, history, and architectural traditions. And they're all work together for him. And the house, which I think is on our next slide, remained in the family until his youngest sister, Dorothy, died in 1967, when it was turned over to the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, now known as Historic New England. Oh, I don't want to go there yet. Ogden was the oldest of 5 siblings. Alice was born in 1866, Thomas in 1868, Hugh in 1875, and then the youngest baby, Dorothy, in 1883. Their father, Ogden Codman Sr., managed the family estates and investments rather than a more developed career, a pattern that the children more or less followed, with the exception of Ogden. As a result of this peripatetic childhood and a lifelong interest in architecture, interiors, and antique furniture, Ogden always felt as home in Europe as he did in America. Indeed, by the middle of his life, he declared that he felt more at home in Europe than he did in his less civilized native land. Okay. Unlike his more leisured siblings, Thomas took up photography, Alice painting, Dorothy gardening. Ogden pursued a busy career as an architect and interior decorator, one of the earliest, I would say. He came especially to admire the classical, colonial architecture and interiors, and this followed a wild interest in the colonial, which came about with the centennial celebrations in 1876. There became a real passion for colonial objects. So people in suburban houses would have a spinning wheel in the living room and that sort of thing. He very much rides that wave. So from an early age, Codman toured the US and Europe taking photographs, drawings, and sketches. And this he continued to do throughout his life. Here I'm giving you a room from his house, the house in Lincoln, that he did up. He would use the Grange as a laboratory. There's a Victorian dining room that an uncle put in. Codman tried to return to the colonial traditions, the classical traditions, but I think you can see it was very loosely interpreted. So he wasn't necessarily interested in creating a museum, but he wanted a comfortable place that recalled and brought forth the past. The second image here is a picture of his office. His first architectural office was 100 Chestnut Street in Boston. That's where he opened his first office. And he opened in 1891. And he lived here in bachelor lodgings and had a room where he had his office. He had spent years, as I said, studying architecture and buildings, especially domestic architecture was what interested him. That's probably why I'm here today. He did study at MIT, possibly for about a year, but that was his only known formal education. He also served apprenticeships with architectural firms, but it didn't sit well with him taking orders from other people, so he thought he would open his own office. In 1893, Codman picked up and moved from New England to New York City, and he opened a new office on 16th Street and Fifth Avenue. He also opened a small office in Newport, Rhode Island. And what he told a friend later was he was following the capitalist money. Here were the New York business people who had the means to build houses that interested him, but he felt they had the means, but they didn't necessarily have the good taste, and he was going to supply that. He came to the rescue when it came to the good taste department. Now, through his work with Edith Wharton, the writer, and her husband, this was really his first big break. He worked with Wharton on her house in Newport. That is the first building. It was called Land's End. Later in Lenox, Massachusetts, the Mount, which is also open for you to visit in the Berkshires. And then he worked on their narrow townhouse on Park Avenue. And these jobs gave him some important visibility. And then when the book came out, he was on his way. In addition to the Wharton commissions and others, gaining the job of designing the family quarters for the Vanderbilt house, the Breakers, also in Newport, was another big break for Codman. He was beginning to work for society people who had the means to build the houses he was interested in. Here is just an image from the house we're in today. Interestingly, Ogden was the only one of his siblings to marry. There were 5 of them. Ironic. But again, as I told you, we're looking at a different world. In 1904, at the age of 41, he married a widow of established fortune, sometimes referred to as a railroad widow. Her name was Lila Webb. She had hired him to design a house in the East 50s in New York, and the two really hit it off. They had a lot of interests in common. They were both interested in domestic architecture, in antiques, and classical models. So the two married and were apparently quite happy. Sadly, after only 5 years of contented life, Lila abruptly died. She had to go into the hospital for emergency surgery, and she did not survive. Rather than remarry, Codman spent the rest of his long life with a succession of male secretaries. More on that later. Here you will see a house he built for himself on East 96th Street, just on the block off Central Park, and his plan was to build a series of houses on that street because this was area just being newly developed. He did build, I think, 3 houses on 96th Street. This was the one he built for himself. It's still there. This is a recent photo, and it is a French school of some kind. He built this house. He didn't move into it until after his wife had died, but he kept it into the 1920s. Oh, wait. Yeah. Even while his wife Lila was still alive, the Codmans spent more and more time in France. As I said, Codman felt comfortable there, as she did, as probably many upper-class Americans did at the time. He would spend part of each year in France. This was painfully interrupted by World War I, where he had to endure a painful exile here at home, and he made do with a big house in Ipswich, Massachusetts, and the house in New York, but he wasn't happy. His letters show us he was not happy. So after the war, he moved permanently to France, moving his official residence in 1920, and he lived in this 17th century house called Grégy outside Paris. It was here that he lived through the German occupation during World War II. And the story was, when the Germans or the Nazis occupied his house, he retreated to his bedroom, where he chose to stay in bed in his silk pajamas, eating chocolates and reading mystery novels and architectural books. When the liberation came and the Nazis left, Codman emerged unscathed. And he died here in 1951, and he's buried in the garden. But there's an interesting architectural interlude before that. And that was an architectural adventure like no other. Codman decided to build himself the house of his dreams. And in 1929, as the Great Depression swept across Europe and the United States, he embarked on what architectural historian Pauline Metcalf calls the culmination of his architectural career, the building of his palatial villa, La Leopolda. Here is an image of people at work and of the facade of the house. The house was built on land once owned by King Leopold of Belgium, and the house eventually loomed over the French Riviera, a monument to Codman's 18th century classical aesthetic. Even before the house was completed, it was discussed and written about a great deal, bringing Codman some much coveted attention as well as dreaded expenses, and eventually piles and piles of debt. Basically, Codman had two huge problems that cast a shadow over this monument. First, the sheer enormity, the size of the place. Here's an image of it today. It's owned by, I believe, somebody from Saudi Arabia, or a rock star, or something like that. The other problem Codman had was, it was 1929 and 1930, and he hadn't planned on the Great Depression. And like many Americans, his income was much reduced, at one point a third of what it had been. His investments had plummeted, and he just had far less money than he was used to. So almost from the time the work began, Codman realized he would have to do something. He would have to sell it or rent it. He attempted again and again, but this was a tough sell in the midst of the Great Depression. Finally, in the late 1930s, it seemed that he had his chance. So the Codman family legend goes something like this. The recently abdicated King of England, Edward VIII, was living in exile in France and searching for a suitably royal house. This seemed to be the place. However, the new Duchess of Windsor, the former Wallis Warfield Simpson of Baltimore, herself was very interested in decoration and interiors. So she had a lot of ideas, and she wanted to undo some of Codman's embellishments. In short, they had a lot of problems coming to terms because Codman wouldn't move one rug, one statue, one lamp. And the family legend goes that when they reached an impasse, the proud owner of La Leopolda had the last word. As he left the king standing in his hotel room, he said, "I regret the House of Codman cannot do business with the House of Windsor." After the deal fell through, Codman wrote in triumph about how the Duchess had now been thwarted by only 3 people in her life: the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Prime Minister of England, who prevented her from becoming queen, and little Ogden Codman, who kept her from spoiling La Leopolda. He triumphed, but he remained the owner of La Leopolda until his death, and saddled with a great deal of debt. It was only sold after he had passed away. Here's an image of Codman as an older man. Now, when he returned to the United States for his mother's funeral in 1923, that was his last trip. He never came back to the United States again. Yet, he continued to stay connected with his family and his friends and the network of people that he had known in Boston and New York. And he continued to keep very close tabs on the house back in Lincoln, even writing letters such as he wrote Tom in the 1930s, "Is the small Hepplewhite card table in the parlor still under the west window where it's supposed to be?" Here's an image of Codman with some visitors and one of his many male secretaries. So organizing one's life around an accepted relationship with the secretary was not unusual in this period. For instance, the writer Gertrude Stein, when she made her famous book tour of the US in the 1930s, she brought along her lover Alice B. Toklas, who was always identified as the writer's secretary. But what did these relationships mean exactly? Let's move back in time and see. We're going to go back to the early 1890s, when the young Bostonian, just starting his architectural career, became friends with two men who became his lifelong friends, his kindred spirits. Fellow architects Arthur Little, here pictured, he's the one against the door in the corner, and Herbert Brown. Little and Brown were also classical architects and colonial revival enthusiasts. And together they opened their own architectural firm in 1890. With their passionate interest in colonial architecture, the three friends became known in their circles as the Colonial Trinity. As their letters tell us, however, the three shared an interest beyond colonial houses. All three were openly sexually attracted to other men. Now you can see what a historian has to deal with. I had to try to decode this scribbling, and I tried to find the clearest one I could to show you. We learn about this world through the letters that Ogden Codman and Arthur Little wrote to each other. There's an important story here that was buried for a few decades. There are 92 of these letters written between 1891 and 1913, but the vast majority are from 2 years, 1892 and 1894. Most often they exchanged letters when one of them was on vacation or touring, and inevitably it was in Europe or England. And so they would send letters back and forth. In 1891, Codman was 29 years old, and Little was 10 years older at 39. Interestingly, Arthur Little also married late in life, the year after Codman did. He married in 1905 at age 52. Here's an image of some friends. In 1892, Codman writes to Little, "I'm rather interested in Walter Abbott, Gordon's younger brother, who has been in New York for a year and is quite unhappy in Boston, where he has to live, and is wild to get back to New York. He is much improved in looks, has rather nice skin and curly hair. He has grown thinner and looks better, but looks cross and says foolish things about Boston, which makes him very unpopular." Little writes back, "How does your smash with Walter Abbott get on? Also the young Gray. You ought to push some of these things and get some wild adventures. A month later, he returns to the topic. How is your smash on Walter Abbott getting on? You don't mention him, so I suspect all sorts of things. Again, Little writes to Codman. How is Russell? I should think it was nearly time for developments. Or, have you been screwing Winnie Clark lately? Codman writes back, I have not seen Winnie Clark this winter, but I shall ask him to dine when the pop concerts begin. Here is Codman with one of his young male friends. There are many examples of these exchanges, but let me focus on one that can best help us understand what is going on here. Near the end of the decade, Little writes to Codman, who is again traveling in Europe, Chapin, your friend has, they say, defaulted or used bank funds. He was a teller. Anyway, hasn't been arrested, as it wasn't much, and his bond covered it all. Papers speak of him as 30 and unmarried, so you see, you thought him too old, and you were not alone, however, or wrong. In all of these exchanges over men that Codman and Little pursue, they all appear to be significantly younger than themselves. Most often they're from their social class, but not always. But I think the common element is they're younger men that they felt they could dominate or treat as objects. So it's a clear pattern of attraction that helps us maybe understand these secretaries later in life. They both had an interest in younger men that they felt they could dominate. We also see that these relationships were, for the most part, fleeting. They didn't have sustained relationships for the most part, rarely lasting more than a few months, and never stopping their interest in discussing other men. In fact, if we tried to do an inventory from the letters, between 1892 and 1894, Codman is pursuing at least 15 young men, and he found time to court 5 young women. And both seem to figure in his future plans. I only have 45 minutes, so I'll not be able to discuss all 15. But let me tell you about one. Charles Hammond Gibson Jr. was a much discussed figure among the two friends. Today, his family house is also a museum in the Back Bay of Boston, the Gibson House Museum, which is a great illustration of typical Victorian Boston house. But back in the 1890s, Little and Codman knew Gibson as Charlie, Little Charlie, Sweet Charlie. Gibson was born in 1874, so he would have been 18 when the two older men began talking about him. They discussed everything imaginable about Gibson, who he was spending time with, where he traveled, who he seemed interested in, etc. In 1892, Codman writes, asked Mason Hammond about little Charlie Gibson. He says, Charlie is a bot boy with very little to him, really just feeble impulses, that he is principally interested in clothes and in Samuel Hooper, with whom he dined at the Parker House. Little writes back pretty quickly. I'm afraid Mason has had little Charlie and therefore discourages you about him, that you might discover it. Both men, Codman and Little, talk about, they talk in terms of sexuality, and that includes the young women. They also, some of the women they talk about, they refer to as low or fallen or common. So they're very paying careful attention to where they fit in on the social hierarchy or the purity hierarchy, which often the two were somewhat interchangeable. But the common thread here is that both groups, the young men, the young women, can be dominated. Since these men were not pursuing a passive role, they were free from the charge of effeminacy, being too feminine, and they considered themselves normal. There's never a discussion ever that they had guilt or shame or concern about these desires. So this was a sexual system distinct from ours. But by the end of the 19th century, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, the hetero and homosexual identities might come into being. They're not really part of the discussion at all in these decades. Here, I'm going to peel back the onion again and give you another sense of Codman's life and times. For his letters, beyond illustrating his sexual attractions, also give us a glimpse into his movements into the urban subcultures that flourished at the time, almost always in urban areas. A sexual subculture that transcended social class, language, and culture. In 1892, a saloon in Lower Manhattan, 157 Bleecker Street, was closed down by the police, and its owner, Thomas Frank Stevenson, was charged with keeping a disorderly house. Keeping a disorderly house, in terms of the law, was a euphemism for supporting prostitution. The New York Press announced at the time, this basement is filled nightly with 100 to 300 people, most of whom are males but are not worthy of the name of men. They are effeminate, degraded, and addicted to vices which are inhuman and unnatural. Another article proclaimed, one of the most vile, vulgar resorts in the city, where no man of decent inclinations would remain for 5 minutes without being nauseated. The working class figure of the fairy is in many of these articles, and the fairy is a working class, somebody we would call transgender today, who models themselves often on working class prostitution. It was sort of a well-known figure in these subcultures, and Codman and Little talk about these effeminate men. They're interested in them, they talk about them, but they always, they talk about them the way one does when going to the zoo and seeing animals in the cage. There's this distance. And we know from their letters that Codman and Little went to the slide. They talk about it. The two friends also discussed visiting Turkish baths, where sexual encounters were common. From the letters, we know they visited baths in Boston, New York, Paris, London, different parts of Italy, and even Montreal. Arthur Little is especially graphic in describing his experiences in these places. I chose not to include much of that, but he's quite graphic. If we at this point return to the young male secretaries that Codman lived with and really structured his households around, at least from the early 1900s up until his death, a clearer picture can emerge. It seems that over these years, Codman continues to search for the right young man, someone to organize his household around, his life around. And it's interesting, in reading through the letters, there's this long succession of failed secretaries. I hope you've deduced the subtext from my talk that Codman at times could be demanding, and this seems very clear from the letters by the secretaries to Codman or about the secretaries. They usually do not remain long. They're insufficiently loyal, they're insufficiently parsimonious, or insufficiently handy. The young men describe a really difficult and demanding employer who sort of blurs the lines between, the personal and the professional. Finally, in the fall of 1931, Codman hits pay dirt and hires at long last the right young man, who is named Francis White, a man in his early 20s, half English and half French, so he could speak to Codman in both languages. And he really became the ideal companion and managed Codman's household until his death. He did go to serve in the army during the Second World War, but otherwise he remained. And Francis features often in the letters to friends and families. Is this young man at the desk Francis White? We're not entirely sure yet. I have another piece of this male subculture that I wanted to touch on, and this was something else that Codman and Little were steeped in, what we might call slightly pornographic or at least erotic images of young men, and also framed in these sort of classical narratives, classical ways, referred to by Little as his Italy boy photos. Both men collected these images, sought them out in Europe, and exchanged them with each other and other friends. Little even bragged in 1894 that he had a scrapbook of 83 of these photos. He filled 2 volumes. He had to keep them under a drawer in his bedroom because he didn't want, the wrong person to see them. They often talk about purchasing these in Europe because they were much easier to get in Europe than in the US, and then mailing them back. In 1891, for instance, Codman writes to Little, who was, again, touring the continent, "I should think you might get some awfully queer engravings and photos in Italy. You might send me some photos anonymously to my Chestnut Street address." This was very common among Americans at the time to collect these kinds of photos, and by framing them as classical or historical, that seemed to provide almost a cover, but at least an explanation. So now my last section. We're going to have a speedy tour of the late 19th century, because this system that Little and Codman were part of, by the 1890s, is going to be hitting the rocks. A 19th century sexual system was about to suffer the first of many death blows, which historians say continued over the course of the 20th century. So here I've given you a small sample of novels and stories and travel accounts that feature male romantic friendships, including by famous writers like Henry James, Charles Warren Stoddard, Bayard Taylor. These were Frederick Loring. Apart from Loring, these other books were very widely read, very widely sold, and very widely talked about. Suffice it to say, in the 19th century, male affections were public, open, and unapologetic, especially if there was no hint of effeminacy or submissiveness or weakness. In other words, as long as one remained male and not female, everything was fine. The other important piece of romantic friendship ideology was similar to the way Victorians talked about sexuality in general. They didn't talk about it. They framed these relationships in terms of being chaste and noble and supportive, the same way a companionate marriage might be considered in these eras. But by the end of the century, things start to bust up a little bit. The 1890s brought some monumental changes. And there are a lot of things happening at the same time, and Codman and Little find themselves sort of caught in the middle of it. I provided you with a title page from Oscar Wilde's 1893 novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which was a sensational hit, and which brought a new focused attention on male friendships. If you don't know that much about Wilde, he was Irish, but had become a really pretty famous writer in England. He had a number of plays running in the West End and was sort of a big deal. And the novel was a big hit. I also have an image of Howard Sturgis. Sturgis was a cousin of Ogden Codman. It seems all the patricians were somehow related to one another. He had moved to England with his parents as a young man and had later became very good friends with Edith Wharton and Henry James. But Sturgis was an aspiring writer, and he published a novel about male friendships in 1891 called Tim. I think it was out of print by 1892, and it hasn't really been in print since, but I think it is available now online. But in this novel, Sturgis talked about this young man, Tim, and his romantic longings for his friend, Carol. And it's very clear in this story that Tim is effeminate, feminine, doesn't fit in, is kind of an oddball, and Carol is sort of a normal boy. And so that raised up all kinds of questions about, oh, wait a minute, what is this effeminate boy interested in the other one for? And so Sturgis had a lot of negative publicity about this book. He did publish 2 other novels, but they didn't involve any male friendships. So he's an interesting example of someone that's kind of hit by this tidal wave of changing times. I've got another person up here, Clyde Fitch. You may not know this, Clyde Fitch was the first American to become a millionaire from his writings. He was a playwright. He wrote a novel, but it wasn't very good and no one read it, but he wrote plays, which were very successful. He's more or less an exact contemporary of Codman. They live in Boston at the same time. They moved to New York at the same time, and they're also attracted sexually to other men. What's interesting about Fitch, he was very feminine. He was, a New York newspaper described his voice as sounding like a hysterical woman who has just missed her train. And so he, even as he's becoming very successful and selling all of these plays, he's constantly dogged by negative publicity, questioning of his male status, questioning of his abilities. He is someone who also suffers as the system starts to break down. Unlike Codman, who lived until 1951, Clyde Fitch had a burst appendix and he died in 1909. So he didn't live to see much of the 20th century. Oh, wait. And then it all blew up. In 1895, the writer Oscar Wilde underwent 3 trials. We won't go into them. There are lots of films and books about it. But suffice it to say, it became clear by the end of the trials that not only was Wilde going to prison, but he was interested in men younger than himself, and he was interested in them sexually. And one of his biggest crimes was he was interested in working class men, so he didn't respect the social boundaries. And this is the first time that many people especially in the UK and the US, begin to wonder about these romantic friendships, begin to wonder about men like not only Codman and Little, but most especially people like Fitch, who sort of could not pass, I guess would the right word be. And here I end with this slide of the writer John Addington Symonds, who is one of the earliest writers who anticipates much of the work of the 20th century sexologist and beginning to sort of flesh out, excuse the pun, flesh out the idea of a man attracted to his own sex. He was interested in classical literature. He had learned Greek. And he was trying to make sense of identities that we might see today as homosexual. He did not think the romantic friendship model made any sense to him. So he sort of anticipates the specter of the hetero and homosexual identities, the modern system that many of us still live in. Two interesting footnotes I will end with, Codman footnotes. For the year 1895, the year of the Wild Trials, there are virtually no letters between Arthur Little and Ogden Codman. My interpretation is things had gotten so hot and so dangerous that they either didn't write letters or they burned them. The other interesting thing is Codman first uses the word homosexual with a hyphen in the middle of it in 1931. So he's already, pretty person of advanced, well, I won't say advanced age because that's close to my own age, but he was older and it was not something that he had experienced or thought about. So if we think about our system of hetero and homosexuality, it doesn't really happen in the same way until well into the 20th century. The Germans were the first who started writing about this, and Symonds, but their ideas were not widely disseminated, certainly until the 20th century. I also have an image of Walt Whitman, because he said all through his life, and I forget my dates, I think he's born in 1819 and he dies in, yes, thank you, 1890s. He was very unapologetic about his sexual attractions to other men. But what's interesting is he sailed under the radar because of this romantic friendship ideology. When The Leaves of Grass was first published, all of the criticism was, he's writing about naked women's bodies, and you can't do that. Now we see he has a lot of male passion in those poems, but most people didn't notice it at the time. I also thought I'd end with a little homework of things that you might want to consider reading. There's not a huge amount written about Codman, but there's a wonderful book by Pauline Metcalf with some wonderful essays and photos. There's a book about Codman published in 1970 by a niece. And then George Chauncey's book, which is now a little dated, but he writes in a really smart way about these working class subcultures. And it's interesting to think about how these different worlds come together. Thank you very much. Does anyone have questions? Yes.
Wait one second, sorry.
We're going to give you a microphone.
Can you please pass this down?
Please talk into the microphone or screaming, that's fine.
Two quick questions. Where did the Codmans get their wealth?
Okay. Yes, so the Codmans were not on the Mayflower, as I understand it, but they earned a lot of their wealth around the time of the Revolution, and then as property owners and business people. And the Grange, the house in Lincoln, has a really interesting history because I believe it was Codman's grandfather lost the house in a bankruptcy, and then the family worked for 30 years to rebuy it, to bring it back. So the wealth goes back certainly past Codman's father, because his father and then Codman's generation they knew how to spend money, but they didn't know how to earn money.
Also, can you hear me? No? No?
Now it's
Oh, okay. Also, their slang. What was smash?
Oh, it's like a crush. You know, I could have given you a whole essay on slang because the two friends develop words. They develop the word queer. One says, well, I think this and this I would call queer, and then somebody writes back, oh, yeah, okay, so-and-so is a queer, and so-and-so and so is a queer. So there's a lot of slang and interesting words in their letters, too.
Where are Codman's letters? Where are they?
His letters are at what is now called Historic New England. I really wish they hadn't changed that name, but it's the current name for the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, and they are housed in Massachusetts. When I worked on the Codman letters, they were in the basement of the Harris and Gray Otis house. I believe they have an archive in, I think it's a shoe factory, maybe Lynn, Massachusetts, something like that. They have all their papers. When Dorothy died, the entire house was turned over to SPNEA, including all their papers. There's an interesting story. When I gave a lecture at Historic New England a couple of years ago, a man came up after and he said he had gone to the Codman house to look through the letters in the, I don't know, it was the 70s, I think. And there was an archivist there. And he found these little Codman letters, and he said to the archivist, wow, look what I found. Look at this, look at that. And he said the man turned purple and red and seemed very upset. And the next day when he went to look at the papers, the archivist said, these papers are no longer allowed for public viewing. That was in the 70s. So everything went to that nonprofit when Dorothy died, and the Codmans saved everything. And I believe that little Hepplewhite card table is still there in the parlor.
Yes. Okay.
I'd be interested in you sort of walking us through the decades as far as his wealth goes. So he started out with some money from his family, and then it sounds like he earned some money, and then he married some money, and then he lost money in the market, and then he had, is all of that, do I have that right so far?
Yeah, you have it basically right. I mean, the interesting part is, he lived so long until 1951, and for at least the last decade, his two remaining siblings, Tom and Dorothy, they're still in Boston and Lincoln, and they are a little beside themselves because they're not sure what to do because Codman is still spending money. And so
Spending money that they gave him?
Well, it was all family money. They didn't really have separate accounts.
Oh.
I think they wished maybe that they would have separate accounts because at one point, Tom and Dorothy had a townhouse on Marlborough Street, and after World War II, they had to sell it because they were running out of money. So they talk about trying to fly Codman on an airplane home to Boston because he seemed to be just draining so much money, but that never happened. I don't think he wanted to get on an airplane.
And then it sounds like you said, I think he started the expensive house just before the Depression. So
Yes.
somehow you talk about the last couple decades, I guess the 30s and 40s, as debt. He's spending a lot of money on this house. And how is he still earning money as an?
Well, he is an architect and an interior decorator, and I would say he probably does the bulk of his work from the 1890s, early 1900s, and then up until he moves to France. And after the 1920s, he doesn't have very many jobs. He works on a house in England for one of his former secretaries who married a railroad widow in England. But he doesn't work as much as he gets older. And I would say it's not just the last decades. I mean, all through his life, he wanted only the best, and everything had to be perfect. And he just spent a lot of money.
Thank you. This is a super, super interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So all of the interaction that you described between him and others, or most of it, was between him and his close circle of what we would call other gay men for the most part. To what extent is there evidence that the Rockefellers, other benefactors' clients, as well as his own family, knew about his sexuality? And if so, what did they think about it?
Yeah, well, I guess I can't speak for the Rockefellers. But certainly Codman's family seemed to be well aware of things because they often talked about the young men that he was living with or traveling with. Codman writes to his mother that maybe I found the perfect friend, but then 2 months later, the perfect friend was not a perfect friend. So these men were often part of his family discussions, so they were not really hidden. I guess if I think about and of course Edith Wharton knew all about these circles because she was part of them. And Howard Sturgis was another person like Clyde Fitch who was very, very feminine, and I would say that's probably one reason he made it was harder for him to kind of be successful. But lots and lots of people knew about these circles. I don't know, the clients, it's hard to say. One would imagine they might have been thrown off the scent by his marriage to Lila, and it was clearly a very happy marriage. So I don't know. I know his family certainly was more accepting and more opening than that archivist from the 1970s.
We have time for one more.
Here's one.
How did Edith Wharton fit into this circle of friends?
So Edith Wharton and Codman became friends because she admired his work and she admired his interest in classical architecture, and they really hit it off. They had this really long, close friendship. They fought a lot, which I think is a really good sign. When he was working on the mount for her in Lenox, at one point she fired him because she said he was charging too much, and besides they had done everything, all these ideas came from both of them, and why should she be paying him for them? And then the time when Edith Wharton had her final stroke, or the stroke that sort of incapacitated her, she was at Codman's house, and Codman was pushing her to issue another edition of their book, because it was out of print at that point. And for him, that had been like, it had made him the cat's meow. Everybody was reading that book and talking about it. So he wanted her to help him do an updated volume, and this was in the 30s, but they were fighting about it. And then she had a stroke, and he never did the book on his own. So she was part of his circle also. She was also very good friends with Henry James, the writer, who was very good friends with Howard Sturgis. So she, in some ways, she was the only female person in Howard Sturgis's circle. It was mostly men. So it was sort of an overlap of interest, I think. In the case of James and Sturgis, it was literature. In the case of Codman, it was architecture. Codman isn't literary in the way that Henry James is, for instance. And I know a lot about the books he read because he talks about them in his letters. And he really was interested in three things: mystery novels, books on architecture, and anything connected to sexuality. So they just had interests that overlapped, yeah. Thank you very much. I believe there's a reception now.